Okay, so what was African American family life like? Well, they really weren't allowed to get married because they weren't recognized as legal citizens, but people still did get married because it was just a piece of paper. Marriage is a vow you take to one other person, and that vow could still be taken even without a piece of paper. Um, so people did get married, and there's this thing called jumping the broom. I've got a picture of it down at the bottom. And many times African American families will still do this thing in an African American wedding. So it's sort of an old tradition that they still do sometimes. Now, in 1808, the importation of slaves was outlawed by the Constitution. And that really did pretty much shut it down. Now, there were some smugglers who brought slaves in from Africa, but pretty much the slave trade from Africa was shut down at that point. So that meant that by 1860, sadly enough, everyone who was a slave, or almost everyone who was a slave by the time the Civil War was fought, had been born into slavery, who had never known anything else except slavery. And so the way they kept their customs alive was to pass stories down from one generation to another, or songs and dance down from one generation to another, much just like every other immigrant group, except that they had no way to do it by writing it down. So whereas, let's pick the German immigrants, because I'm come from German immigrants, so I'll pick on them. So the German immigrants could write down their stories. The German immigrants could write little books about themselves or whatever, but not the African Americans, because they really weren't supposed to be able to read and write. So any stories they had that were passed down from one generation to the next had to be done by word of mouth and memorized, much like Native Americans did, which is how they passed their culture down. All right, African American religion was very important. So oddly enough, African Americans were not supposed to be taught to read and write, because that would enable them to communicate, and they were not supposed to be able to communicate with each other over long distances, or secretly or anything like that. So you weren't supposed to teach your slaves to read and write. Some slave owners still did, because they wanted them to learn to read the Bible. They were trying to make them into Christians. They thought that would be a good thing. You can never have too many Christians. So they did teach them to read so they could read the Bible. But Christianity is a religion full of hope, and even in the Old Testament, the Jews were kept in captivity and in slavery forever by the Egyptians, building their pyramids and whatever. But Moses eventually comes and leads them out of slavery in the Old Testament. And so this gave the slaves hope that someday they too would be freed from their slavery, which exactly is what happens. One of the most famous abolitionists and people who worked on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, she was known as Moses. All right, slave codes. Slave codes are laws that were written to control slaves and the slave owners. In the slave codes were things that you could do to punish your slaves, and things like that you're not allowed to teach them to read and write. Eventually it becomes a crime to actually teach one of your slaves to read and write. And you might wonder, well, why would a slave owner teach a slave to read and write? Well, some slave owners saw this as a resource. They could teach a slave how to do the books for their plantation, keep track of how much cotton was sold, keep track of how much we paid for cotton seed, how much we had to spend on repairing machinery last year, that kind of thing. I wouldn't have to pay someone to keep track of that, and I wouldn't have to do it myself if I could teach a slave to do it. So some plantation owners saw that as a resource. But the slave codes were written so that a slave rebellion would be less likely to occur, because if you see the facts down at the bottom, if a slave rebellion never happened, the white people were going to be in a bad way. All right, the slave codes prevented slaves from gathering in large groups, and also mandated that slaves have some sort of written pass if they were off the plantation for some reason or another. And I made a big deal about this in class, this term "off the plantation" has many meanings in our culture today. if you are talking about someone being off the plantation, it usually means that they are outside the boundaries of what is normal or outside the boundaries of being safe. They're doing something that is going to draw attention to themselves to cause themselves to be in trouble, is what you're talking about someone being off the plantation. So if a slave back in those days is off the plantation without papers, they're going to be in trouble. And again, the codes, you should not be teaching your slaves to read and write. But the most famous early slave rebellion was the Nat Turner Rebellion, and he's likely to be tested, so you need to know him. Now, he had taught himself to read and write, and he led a slave revolt in Virginia where his followers, and I have to double check on this date, I'm not 100% sure it's correct, but you need to know it's very early on, 1835, 1838, something like that. He and his followers got some guns, and they killed every single white person they could find in the Virginia countryside. And I literally mean every man, woman, child, baby in a cradle they could find. They killed them all. And even Harriet Tubman wrote about this. I do know pretty much about her because she's one of my favorite people to study up on. She wrote that this was a bad thing because it only made things worse for all the rest of the slaves. Because, of course, after this rebellion, all the rest of the white people were scared half to death that this was going to happen near them. Now, of course, the rebellion wasn't successful. Turner and his people were tracked down and caught and executed. But even more strict slave codes were passed after that. And it was even harder for all the rest of the slaves across the South. And I want to take a second here to talk about this because you might think about how terrible Turner was in killing even children. But in his twisted mind, they were just going to simply grow up to be more slave owners and beat up more children of, more African American children. So it wasn't sane thinking. And even like I said, Harriet Tubman could not see any use for this. But that was his thinking. For the most part, though, slaves resisted in more passive ways, such as like slowing down their work, or gee, I don't know how that wagon wheel got broken, or I'm so sick today, I can't work. That was the kind of way that they resisted more often than an outright slave revolt, because the slave revolts could not work because they really could not get their hands on weapons of any magnitude to be able to pull something like that off. Now, let's talk about escaping slavery for just a little bit. I want you to take a look at the map. The map up there really has to do with the Civil War, but it serves my purpose. The red states were the Deep South states, the states that pulled away with the Confederacy. The yellow states are the border states that stayed with the North but still had slavery. And all the blue states stayed with the North and were the United States during the Civil War. But what I want you to think about is, unless you were a slave in a state like, let's see if I get my cursor up here, like Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, unless you are a slave here, trying to escape to the North is nearly impossible because the distance you have to go here is too great. You are likely to get caught. But the people who lived in those upper South states, there were successful escapes from there. And as soon as you got across the Ohio River or up into Pennsylvania, you're home free because the Quakers live in Pennsylvania and the Quakers are going to help you out. And as soon as you get across the Ohio River into Ohio, you're in a northern state. If you were living down here as a slave in Louisiana or Texas, your best place to run would be down here in Mexico because, again, the Spanish and the Mexicans, neither one of those groups ever believed in slavery. And so if you could get that far, you would be safe then. Okay, so we have a little slide here about Harriet Tubman because, again, she's one of Mrs. Butt's favorite characters. And really, she was very, very influential. She was one of the most successful people in helping slaves escape to the North. You have to know, for test purposes, honestly, that she's also known as Moses because she led so many people out of slavery, or the conductor because this thing is called the Underground Railroad. And, a railroad has to have a conductor, so she was called the conductor. She helped over 300 slaves escape from freedom, which is literally probably a property in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that she's damaging or stealing. And so for that reason, she had a bounty on her head of $40,000, which is equivalent to over $1 million in today's money. But she was never caught. She was never once caught in all the time that she went back multiple times into the South to help people escape. All right, let's talk about southern cities for just a minute. I don't want to dwell on this because it's the same old thing I keep telling you. You have to understand where people live and why they live there. The largest cities include Baltimore, Maryland, and New Orleans. And the cities are either on seaports or rivers. The only other cities that became influential were Chattanooga, Montgomery, and Atlanta, and they became influential as railroad hubs later on. So again, like I've mentioned to you before, cities were springing up along canals, rivers, and railroads because that's where people have transportation. Free African Americans in these cities formed their own communities and their own businesses, but they're absolutely second-class citizens. And I can't imagine that African Americans would stay in these cities for very long because it would not be safe for them, honestly. It's not a safe place for them to be. So I'm sure a lot of them, as soon as they could, would get to the north. There's no statewide public school systems for whites or African Americans, so people who could afford to send their children to private schools or hire a tutor. And so the South naturally is going to lag behind the North in literacy in many other ways. Again, the South, I can tell you quite honestly, the South lagged behind the North up until the mid-1900s. It didn't just stop with the Civil War, because the Civil War damaged the South badly. And I just know for a fact that the South lagged behind the North developmentally even up until, I would say, the 1950s, the 1960s, and maybe even the early 1970s. It wasn't really until after that that some of the major cities and the major areas of the South started catching up with the North.